He's an assistant professor at King's College here in London. Thank you very much for joining us here in the studio, Andreas. So, first of all, I mean, we're talking about back to 2nd of October when the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi entered a Saudi consulate in Istanbul and he disappeared from that day on. So since then, the Saudis have changed their version of events 3 times, I believe. And we've heard many things, many stories. Now, we actually got details from the Istanbul's prosecutor, chief prosecutor, saying he was strangled the minute he got in there and dismembered. What do you make of it all?
Well, I mean, what we see for the last, well, more than 4 weeks is a bit of a tit-for-tat between Turkey and Riyadh about, coming clean on what actually happened. As you said, the Saudis have come up with different versions of the truth, different versions of facts, and have really only come around to cooperating with the Turks and actually coming up with an investigation that somewhat looks at what actually happened, coming up with some of the concessions and confessions that initially we wanted to see from the Saudis, but only because the pressure from Washington was actually mounting. So it doesn't really matter what the Europeans are doing. I don't think it doesn't matter what Turkey is doing per se. It's really what happens in Washington. And I think the Trump administration, and especially Republican backers of the Saudi king and especially the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, them coming out and putting pressure on Mohammed bin Salman, saying you have to tell the truth, you have to come clean now, stop with the cover-up, as Donald Trump said. This has really led to them actually starting an investigation. Nonetheless, I think the hope here for the new conservatives in Washington, as well as for the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is let's try to delay it. Let's try to play it with salami tactics as well. If the Turks put pressure, we're going to make one step at a time. We'll never come clean fully, because as we see now, this has been going on in the media, international global audience, for more than a month, and we're seeing now that this is dying down. The urgency of it is dying down. They hope that within a couple of weeks, this will all somewhat be covered up. This becomes a side story, and then you can actually go and come up with some sort of wannabe explanation of what actually happened. And I think this is the fear here that Turkey has. Turkey wants to show that actually there is more to it than what the Saudis are saying. Mohammed bin Salman and his direct aides around him, his friends, have actually been involved in this. This has been somewhat planned from the beginning. So let's say, let's call the spade, and let's say that Mohammed bin Salman has been involved in it. So this, and the problem is for the Trump administration is they don't really want to accept that. They want to have presented the Saudis with a range of different options to come clean without actually incriminating Mohammed bin Salman in his direct environment. So, and I think that is kind of the struggle here. But the longer this is being protracted, the higher the chance that the urgency of that crisis will somewhat disappear, and that will work only in the favor of the Saudis, because as long as the global public is basically putting all eyes on what's happening in Saudi Arabia, they will have to come up with some facts.
And do you think the US should put more pressure on Saudi Arabia at this point? I mean, there's also the news of the Saudi Prince Ahmed returning to Saudi Arabia today. This is a person we're talking about who's been critical of the Crown Prince and who's been in London for a long time. So do you think the US is putting pressure and using him as a bridge?
Absolutely. I mean, the pressure has been mounting from Washington. I came back from Washington last week. I had loads of different meetings, bipartisan Republicans and also Democrats. And what you can hear is they want Saudis. They demand answers. Even those who are the most pro-Saudi, you can imagine, say we demand answers from Saudi Arabia. The pressure is mounting on Saudi's involvement in the Qatar crisis. It is mounting in terms of their Saudi involvement in Yemen. And in both instances, I think the Trump administration knows that their entire Middle East strategy is built around Mohammed bin Salman. So they don't want him to somewhat disappear, because he's kind of a very loyal proxy in this part of the world. However, they're using this and exercising leverage to get the concessions from Saudi Arabia that they have failed to get over the last couple of months. One is Saudi needs to make a very big step towards Qatar and actually solving this crisis. And I think there have been talks going on with the Qataris. The Saudis have shown a willingness to somewhat lift the blockade, at least partially, showing as a sign of goodwill. There has been pressure now by Pompeo and Mattis saying, Saudi has to come clean on Yemen. We want to see a a peace deal and a negotiation around the table with the Houthis and all the others involved in Yemen in the next 30 days. So that is quite a lot of pressure there.
That is, and Yemen was a topic where they've been quiet for a very long time. But looking at the facts, I mean, this is a first. A Saudi journalist, a journalist being killed in a country in their own soil, and this will set an example for the future of freedom of expression, of journalists' safety. When you look at all the aspects, do you think the truth will actually eventually come out? Will they put enough pressure, not just the US, but the EU itself as well? Because when we look at Russia and the agents that were killed in Salisbury, we saw sanctions straight away. So what needs to happen here?
Well, I mean, this is the problem is there's an alternative narrative coming out, and that narrative is trying to undermine the narrative of Jamal being actually a journalist and, you know, being someone who's in it for the freedom of speech. And this counter-narrative that the Saudis have spread, the Emiratis have spread, is basically saying Jamal was actually a rogue element within the Secret Service. He was an agent that had to be eliminated. He's not just a journalist. And that kind of narrative is very, very dangerous. And I think this is something which, you know, where the Europeans have somewhat trying to go around and saying, you know, actually we need to be a bit more careful about this. But it is really, like I always say, the center of gravity in all this lies in Washington. But what the Turks can do is, because they have the monopoly over the evidence, they have the audio tapes, they have the evidence that will incriminate Mohammed bin Salman, that will incriminate the Saudis, and they will hold him to account. And we can see this. Whenever the Saudis are trying to make a U-turn, somewhat getting away from the truth, you know, there is another statement being made by the Turks. And when I say the Turks, it's actually never, as we say, it's not the Turkish government, it's actually the prosecutor, it's the media, it's leaks to the media. And I think that is something that is very powerful and continues playing. Let me make a comment about Prince Ahmed, because there's now being seen as, you know, there's a lot of pressure on Mohammed bin Salman, him possibly leaving, and the Europeans giving him backing, Prince Ahmed, to return to Riyadh. We shouldn't forget that Mohammed bin Salman is very much in the driver's seat, and he will remain in that position just because he has so much control over the security sector. Prince Ahmed is someone of the old guard, you know, very much in friends and, you know, as a brother of his father, is not someone who has the kind of gravitas and the kind of reputation to get things done in Riyadh. And I think he is not there to threaten or take the throne away from Mohammed bin Salman. I think he's there as, you know, the King Salman telling his son, look, we need to have some face-saving measures here. Get rid of your friends as the advisors and get the old guard back in to advise you to become a better crown prince. And I think this is exactly what's happening in Saudi Arabia. So for the Trump administration, they're able to show one thing. A, the Saudis are making progress in Yemen. B, they need to show that the Saudis are making progress in the Qatar crisis. And three, there are consequences within the direct environment of Mohammed bin Salman. But at the same time, Mohammed bin Salman is going to be there and stay there and remain there as a proxy for the Americans to actually get things done on the ground. That is the perfect situation for the Trump administration. So how much can the Europeans really do? For the weapons sale
to continue as well.
Exactly, for repression to continue. But that is not on the books. Nobody's talking about trying to liberalize Saudi Arabia, because neither Europeans nor the Americans are really interested in jumping out there and making a stance on freedom of speech, because they haven't done so in the last couple of years.
Well, thank you very much for that insight, Andreas Krieg, here with us.
Thank you.
So a reminder of the breaking news out of Turkey. The Turkish Chief Prosecutor's Office has released a statement on the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Our diplomatic correspondent Hassan Abdullah is in Ankara for us. Our Turkey analyst Yusuf Erim is live from our Istanbul studio. But first, let's talk more to our correspondent John Joe Reagan, who is just outside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So John Joe, you've been following the story from day one, and now we've come to a point where we've heard from the Istanbul's prosecutor what happened inside the Saudi consulate there. So what has he said?